You feel pain like no other pain, and you know that in your life it's going to be very difficult to...
Prince William expected a difficult morning. He did not expect a parliamentary clerk to place two versions of the same royal record side by side and expose a difference capable of shaking the monarchy from within. One carried the original wording. The second contained a rewritten entry connected directly to Camilla. As the chamber absorbed what had been uncovered, William stopped speaking, lowered his eyes, and understood that this was no ordinary palace embarrassment. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The discovery landed with brutal force. Parliament had been reviewing Crown administrative records when officials found two conflicting copies of a sealed entry known as the Crown Continuity Register. That register was an official archive used to record sensitive royal household and constitutional authorizations, meaning any alteration carried weight beyond ordinary paperwork. One version limited Camilla's access to protected royal privileges. The other replaced those limits with language granting her broader authority. William read the changed paragraph twice. He pushed his chair away from the table, then asked whether the authorization attached to the altered version had been verified. No one rushed to answer. The silence told him enough, before the examiner confirmed that the disputed signature could not be reconciled with the authenticated original. The prince felt the damage instantly. This was no longer about a technical mistake. Someone had made a false approval look legitimate, and someone inside the royal system had allowed it to survive. The timing made everything worse. Archived handling notes showed that the alteration had appeared years before the parliamentary review. That meant the false record had passed through multiple rounds of internal handling without being stopped. William could accept human error. What he could not accept was the possibility that people close to the crown had seen the inconsistency, understood what it meant, and chosen silence. Then one examiner slid another page toward him. A palace reference number attached to the replacement document connected the amendment to correspondence from Camilla's private household office. William stared at the code, then at the forged approval, and his expression hardened. The Queen Consort had now become more than a name in the margins. Her office sat inside the trail itself. William did not ask whether Parliament planned to continue. He asked one question: did Charles know? When no answer came, he closed the folder and requested a private meeting with his father, alone. But before William could confront the king, he had to face the far more painful question buried beneath the forged signature. What exactly had Camilla believed she was entitled to change? Behind the constitutional language were three people bound together by marriage, inheritance, loyalty, and decades of unresolved history. For William, the record threatened the future he had spent his life preparing to protect. For Charles, it challenged the stability of the reign he had fought years to establish. And for Camilla, the parliamentary disclosure transformed a hidden administrative decision into something painfully personal, a test of whether the family still trusted her at all. William felt the danger differently from everyone else. As heir to the throne, he knew that every precedent involving royal authority could eventually become his responsibility. The heir is the person next in line to become monarch, which meant he could not look at the forged record only as a son caught between his father and stepmother. He had to think about what happened when private influence crossed into powers meant to survive generations. If he ignored that boundary now, he might inherit the consequences later. Charles carried an equally painful burden. The disputed entry involved his wife, yet the king also stood as guardian of a system that depended on trust. Crown records were not ordinary family notes. They were formal documents, recording sensitive permissions and decisions connected to the monarchy. If those records could be quietly reshaped around personal wishes, then every future decision would become vulnerable to doubt. He understood that protecting Camilla too aggressively could damage the very institution he was trying to defend. William finally spoke about what was truly tormenting him when he sat alone with Catherine. He removed his reading glasses, placed the parliamentary summary on the table, and admitted that the forged approval was not the deepest wound. What frightened him was the possibility that Charles had discovered the truth earlier and chosen to shield Camilla. Catherine listened without interrupting. When he looked back at the papers, the prince said that he could survive scandal. He was not sure he could easily survive betrayal from his own father. Camilla received her own blow hours later. She opened a formal notice, informing her that Parliament had requested additional archival correspondence linked to her household office. She tightened her grip on the envelope, dismissed her aide, and remained seated after the door closed. The Queen Consort now understood that investigators were moving beyond a single altered page. They were tracing conversations, requests, and decisions that could lead directly into her private circle. Then the stakes widened again. William learned that the changed wording potentially affected access to private briefings, sealed inventories, legacy records, and influence over certain household appointments when the sovereign was unavailable. More disturbing still, the original version contained a safeguard inserted by senior royal advisors to stop future spouses from gaining independent authority over hereditary crown matters. That safeguard had not vanished by accident. Someone had pushed to remove it. And deep inside the archive, investigators had found a meeting note identifying the exact day that pressure began. The parliamentary bombshell had exposed the forged page, but the real story began years earlier, during one private meeting that turned a disagreement over protocol into the point of no return. Years before Parliament exposed the altered record, a private Windsor meeting had already planted the seed of the crisis. It lasted less than an hour. There were no cameras, no public statements, and no reason for anyone outside the palace to remember the date. Yet one disagreement inside that room would eventually become the foundation of everything now tearing through the family. Looking back, William would realize the disaster had not begun with Parliament. It began there. Camilla had grown increasingly frustrated by a rule that seemed to stop her at the edge of certain royal decisions. The Crown Continuity Register, a formal record used to preserve sensitive authority over hereditary matters, made clear that some decisions belonged directly to the sovereign and heir. That meant a royal spouse could not independently change access to sealed archives, ownership records, or succession-related household arrangements. To senior courtiers, the restriction protected continuity. To her, it increasingly felt like a wall. The breaking point came after a major state reception at Windsor Castle. Camilla had asked to review a sealed collection connected to long-term royal household planning, but an archivist refused to release it without direct authorization from Charles. She was furious. Later that evening, during a private meeting with the King and William, she pushed for the restriction to be rewritten. She argued that her public responsibilities had grown while her internal authority had remained frozen in place. The Queen Consort wanted the rule changed permanently. William resisted immediately. He closed the folder in front of him and told Charles that respect for a royal spouse did not require dismantling safeguards built to survive marriages, reigns, and personalities. The prince knew why the rule mattered. Once a boundary around hereditary authority was weakened for one person, future courts could use the same precedent for far more dangerous purposes. Camilla heard his objection as distrust. He saw her request as a threat to structure. Charles chose caution. He refused to approve a permanent amendment that night and instructed that the restriction remain untouched unless it passed through proper constitutional and household review. The original meeting minutes recorded that decision clearly. The king believed the matter had ended there. 6 weeks later, everything changed. A replacement page appeared inside the archive. Charles's refusal had vanished. In its place stood wording claiming that expanded access had already been approved. Years later, Parliament would identify the signature attached to that authorization as inconsistent with the authenticated original. The change was not merely convenient. It contradicted the decision made inside Windsor. William then discovered the detail that made his anger turn cold. One palace officer had handled both versions of the record. That same official later transferred into Camilla's household. Suddenly, the old meeting was no longer history. It was evidence. With the Windsor confrontation exposed as the true beginning, William no longer wanted paperwork or intermediaries. He wanted an answer from Camilla herself. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. That made it worse. William entered carrying only a thin parliamentary folder, closed the door behind him, and remained standing while Camilla waited beside the table. There were no aides, no secretaries, and no palace officials to soften what came next. He placed the disputed record between them and asked 4 words that stripped away every layer of ceremony. "Did you know about this?" William had insisted on privacy because he wanted an answer before lawyers, courtiers, communications advisors, or Charles could influence the conversation. He placed the original record beside the altered copy and pointed to the exact sentence that had changed. The prince wanted no escape into old grievances. This was about one decision, one altered authorization, and a safeguard that had somehow disappeared. Camilla answered carefully. She admitted asking for greater access, but she denied instructing anyone to forge approval. The Queen Consort said she believed the dispute had been settled through proper channels after the Windsor meeting. William did not argue. He simply turned the replacement page toward her and asked why correspondence from her private household office was attached to the amendment. Camilla hesitated. That pause carried more weight than anger could have. When William mentioned the Windsor meeting and Charles's refusal, she admitted that she had later been told by a senior household officer that the matter had been resolved. She said she believed the king had reconsidered privately. The prince listened, but his expression hardened because the original minutes showed no such reversal. Then, William opened the folder again. A newly recovered memorandum showed that Camilla had received a warning several days before the replacement page entered the archive. The message stated that final authorization remained incomplete. In plain terms, the required approval had not yet been secured, which meant any permanent change should have stopped there. William pushed the memorandum across the table and asked why she had not challenged what happened next. Camilla finally admitted receiving it. She insisted she believed the remaining procedure would be completed legitimately, and that she never imagined someone would substitute an unauthorized page. Her admission shifted everything. She could still deny ordering the forgery, but she could no longer claim she knew nothing about the irregular path leading toward it. William stood in silence for a moment. Then he told her, Parliament now held more than a suspicious signature. Investigators had reconstructed a chain of approval, showing who requested the benefit, who handled the warning, who remained silent, and who possessed enough authority to stop the alteration before it survived. He did not accuse Camilla of forging the record herself, not yet. The confrontation answered one question, but created another far more dangerous one. If Camilla did not personally forge the record, who had enough authority inside the palace to make the false version survive? Every forged document needs more than ink. It needs access, opportunity, and someone confident enough to believe the alteration will never be challenged. Parliament now followed that trail beyond Camilla's request and into the machinery surrounding the monarch himself. Yet the most painful moment came not in a committee room, but inside Charles's private study, when the king read the original Windsor instruction and realized his own refusal had somehow been transformed into approval. Parliamentary examiners traced the replacement page through archival handling records and found that only a small circle of senior household officials had the clearance required to substitute a protected entry. That mattered because sensitive crown records could not be changed simply because someone close to the monarch wanted a different outcome. Formal authority meant written approval from the person legally empowered to give it. A spouse's request was not the same as a sovereign's consent, and the altered page had blurred that line completely. Charles read the evidence beside William in silence. He reached the forged authorization, removed his glasses, and placed them next to the file. For several seconds, the king said nothing. The prince watched him carefully, then asked the question he had been carrying since Parliament first exposed the discrepancy. Had his father ever privately approved the amendment after Windsor? Charles answered with one word: no. William felt the last easy explanation collapse. If the king had never changed his mind, then the altered entry could no longer be dismissed as poor communication or confused paperwork. Someone had transformed a refusal into approval. The prince looked back at the signature and understood that the crisis had moved beyond Camilla's ambition. It now involved the misuse of the monarch's own authority. The archival trail tightened further. A former senior household official had processed the new wording after repeated communications with Camilla's office, then marked the amendment as having received sovereign approval. Parliament's documented review showed that the same official had access to both the original Windsor instruction and the replacement page. Charles now knew someone inside his household had seen the contradiction and allowed it to stand. Then another discovery deepened the betrayal. Months after the alteration, internal concerns had been raised about conflicting versions of the record. Instead of opening an investigation, staff separated the documents into different archival files. Reviewers no longer saw them side by side. The problem had not disappeared. It had been buried. Charles understood what came next. He could limit cooperation and protect his wife from further humiliation, or he could open the palace files completely and risk exposing even more damaging evidence. William said nothing. He did not need to. The king finally made his choice, and when he did, the consequences reached Camilla before the palace could even prepare the public explanation. The first consequence was almost silent. No announcement echoed through the palace. No dramatic decree was read aloud. Camilla simply arrived for a scheduled private briefing and discovered that the sealed crown papers normally placed at her seat were missing. An official quietly explained that her discretionary access had been suspended while Parliament completed its review. She looked toward the empty space on the table, nodded once, and understood exactly what had changed. Charles had authorized full cooperation with Parliament, and that decision reached far beyond one disputed page. Every privilege tied to the altered record was temporarily suspended, until investigators could separate valid permissions from those created by the false amendment. Discretionary access meant the ability to receive certain sensitive material without requesting fresh approval each time. For Camilla, losing that access did not erase her marriage, rank, or public role, but it drew a sharp line between ceremonial status and administrative power. Trust had become something she now had to earn back. Camilla returned to her rooms and asked her staff to cancel 2 non-essential meetings. She dismissed everyone, then studied the parliamentary notice alone. The Queen Consort did not lash out. She did not call advisors. Instead, she sat with the reality that the restrictions were no longer theoretical. The investigation had entered her daily life, and the silence around her felt heavier than any headline. Charles came to see her later. Camilla asked the question she had been avoiding. Did he believe she ordered the forgery? The king answered carefully. He said he believed she wanted the restriction changed, and he believed she accepted a process that should have raised more questions. But he also said he had not seen proof that she personally instructed anyone to falsify his approval. His restraint did not comfort her. It made the distance between them clearer. Then Parliament added another layer. A former senior household officer agreed to provide a documented account explaining the requests, warnings, and approvals surrounding the altered record. The account stated that pressure existed to regularize Camilla's access after the Windsor refusal. Staff, it said, feared challenging what they believed had become the preference of the king's private household. The testimony was damaging, but it stopped short of proving that Camilla ordered the forged signature. That distinction mattered. It also left William facing a harder decision than simple punishment. Soon, Charles asked his son to meet privately. With Camilla isolated and Parliament closing in, father and son were left alone with a question no record could answer for them. What mattered more now? Punishment, or protecting the crown from becoming consumed by revenge? For days, William had carried anger like armor. Then Charles asked him to sit down without advisors, files, or lawyers present. Nothing rested on the table between them. For once, there was no document to interpret, and no official language to hide behind. The king spoke first. He admitted he should have demanded answers years earlier. William listened, still wounded, but the conversation slowly shifted from who had failed to what kind of monarchy they wanted to preserve. Charles knew Parliament had already established enough to make denial impossible. Camilla had pushed for the restriction to be removed. A senior official had processed an unauthorized alteration. Later warnings had failed to trigger a proper correction. Yet, intent remained the hardest part. Institutional misconduct meant serious failures inside the royal system, but the evidence still did not prove that the Queen Consort had personally ordered anyone to copy or falsify the king's authorization. Charles spoke without defending what had happened. He told William that seeing his authority misused had left him feeling personally betrayed. The monarch could accept that mistakes had been made around him, but he could not pretend that a false approval carrying his authority was a minor administrative error. Still, he refused to turn uncertainty into accusation simply because the public might prefer one clear villain. William admitted his first instinct had been harsher. He wanted every privilege connected to the altered record removed permanently. The prince had spent his life preparing to protect the institution, and the thought that its safeguards had been bent through private pressure made him furious. But as he sat across from his father, he also accepted something harder. Justice could not mean blaming Camilla for actions the evidence did not actually prove. The decision came quietly. Father and son agreed that the forged record would be formally voided. Every privilege created by it would disappear. Future access to sensitive material would require transparent written authorization, preserved in one unified register, meaning conflicting versions could no longer be hidden in separate files. Charles went further. He decided that the former official who processed the false amendment would be permanently removed from Crown record responsibilities. The old warning failures would also remain inside the archive, rather than being erased. The king wanted the record to show not only what went wrong, but how long the system had failed to correct it. William asked for one final condition. The palace must not call the scandal a clerical mistake. The public would be told that an unauthorized record existed, that proper authority had been bypassed, and that the system failed to stop it. Charles agreed. That insistence on plain language would soon carry the crisis beyond palace walls and transform a family wound into a national conversation about trust. By morning, the scandal no longer belonged to Parliament or the palace. It belonged to everyone. Outside Buckingham Palace, visitors stopped beside newspaper stands, carrying the same extraordinary image. William, leaving the parliamentary briefing, beneath a headline declaring that a forged crown record had been voided. Television networks abandoned softer royal coverage. Commentators debated responsibility, loyalty, and accountability. Yet one detail in the official response changed the mood completely. The palace did not deny the record existed. The palace statement confirmed that the disputed crown entry had been invalidated, and that every authority created specifically by the altered version was withdrawn. That mattered because the document had touched sensitive access, household influence, and protected royal records. Parliament then released its own summary. It stated that the amendment was unauthorized, The approval was invalid, and Camilla had sought the underlying change. But it also made one distinction clear. Investigators had not found direct proof that she personally created or ordered the forged authorization. William watched the coverage from Kensington Palace beside Catherine. The Princess of Wales listened as one broadcaster framed the scandal as a personal war between him and Camilla. He reached for the remote and switched off the television. The prince told Catherine that reducing everything to family rivalry missed the real danger. If a false record could survive because people were afraid to challenge royal influence, then the failure belonged to the system as much as to any single person. Camilla faced a different kind of pain. She saw her photograph repeated across front pages beside one word she feared would follow her for years: forgery. Later, she told Charles that she understood why the restrictions had to remain. The Queen Consort did not ask him to reverse the decision. She only admitted that being publicly tied to the scandal might never fully disappear. The king listened, knowing he could protect neither her reputation nor the institution by pretending the evidence was less serious than it was. Then one public moment captured everything. A crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace as newspaper stands displayed the same front-page phrase, "The record that never had the king's approval." People stopped to read it. Broadcasters repeated it. The sentence became the simple expression of a complicated crisis. Public anger slowly shifted as Parliament emphasized the difference between seeking an advantage and personally ordering a forgery. The focus widened toward the palace culture that had allowed an unauthorized record to remain unchallenged. William knew one conversation still remained. He had to face Camilla again, not to interrogate her, but to tell her what the monarchy had decided would survive this scandal, and what would not. The world had delivered its judgment loudly. The final verdict inside the family would be quieter, harder, and permanent. There was no triumph in the final meeting. William did not arrive seeking an apology dramatic enough to erase what had happened. And Camilla no longer tried to defend every choice that had brought them there. Between them rested the parliamentary judgment and the order permanently voiding the forged record. What began as a revelation about hidden paperwork had become something far more painful, a reckoning over trust, responsibility, and the danger of allowing private influence to outrun public duty. Parliament's final findings left little room for confusion. The Crown record had been improperly altered, and the authorization attached to it had never been granted by Charles. A Crown record was more than internal paperwork. It preserved formal decisions that could affect royal access, authority, and continuity. The false version was now permanently invalid, and no future decision could rely upon it. The former household official carried responsibility for processing the unauthorized change, while the palace itself carried responsibility for failing to stop conflicting records from surviving side by side. William looked directly at Camilla and finally explained what had devastated him most. It was not simply that she had wanted greater influence. It was that loyalty to individuals had been allowed to blur rules designed to protect the monarchy from exactly this kind of pressure. The prince told her that once private relationships became stronger than written safeguards, trust inside the institution could collapse faster than any public scandal. Camilla did not ask for the lost privileges to be restored. She accepted that the expanded access had to remain gone. The Queen Consort admitted she should have stopped pushing the moment she learned the authorization process was uncertain. She still denied ordering a forged signature, but she no longer tried to separate herself from every consequence that followed. Charles then made the settlement permanent. He signed a reform requiring sensitive Crown records to carry independently verified authorization, mirrored archival copies, and automatic review whenever changes affected the monarch, heir, or royal spouse. The king had learned the cost of delayed scrutiny, and he refused to leave the same weakness behind for William to inherit. William chose accountability without destruction. He did not seek to remove Camilla from the family, but he refused to preserve any authority created through the false record. The relationship would continue, though under boundaries that could never again be quietly rewritten. And when the final order was placed into the archive beside the document that caused the crisis, the message was unmistakable. Royal influence could bend relationships, divide families, and test loyalty, but it would never again be allowed to rewrite the record. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.